Lecture 18 quiz encompasses a lot of information, and the reason why on Canvas it says Lecture 18 Part 1 and Lecture 18 Part 2 is primarily because I used to have them as two separate lectures, but Lecture 18, as it originally was so short, it was hard to get a 10-point question in there with, or 10 questions on the quiz without really stretching some things. So I found eventually that if I combined the two, that it made it so that I can do a variety of different questions. And so you'll find that on part one, which is the original lecture 18, you have pretty much four questions that you're going to have based upon all these concepts that you see right here. So these six concepts that you see, the three different types of population distribution, the reproductive strategies, the density factors, carrying capacity, population characteristics, and extinction, those are all grouped together into four different questions. Now, as such, you're not necessarily going to have a question on every single one of these. Extinction, you're guaranteed to have a question on. Population distribution, you're guaranteed to have a question on. And reproductive strategies, you're going to have one on. But the other three, density factors, carrying capacity, and population characteristics, those are all grouped together. So it's not certain that you're going to have one on each one of these. So I would say, study these, but don't be looking for any additional ones. And you're like, oh, okay, I got the one on carrying capacity. So take them as they come, to you on the quiz, because it is randomized. But some of these, there's not much that I could do beyond just defining carrying capacity or showing the difference between density dependent and density independent factors, or differences between population characteristics. And so I grouped them together because there was a lot more questions I could do on reproductive strategies, population distribution, and extinction. So that's how they're generally grouped together. You're not going to have 6 questions on the first half, you'll have 4 questions. And then on the second half, you basically have a question on each one of these concepts. One on community interactions, one on keystone species, one on succession, one on the ecological pyramid, one on chemical cycles, and one on the difference between biomagnification and bioaccumulation. So that's kind of the distribution of the questions on the quiz. Let's do just a little bit of review. For population distribution, that's one where you just need to know what the characteristics of the uniform versus random versus clump distribution is. And it will describe one of those distributions, and you'll say, oh, that's a clump distribution. Or it'll say which of the following is not a characteristic of a clump distribution, in which case you'd be looking for the one that describes the uniform distribution or the random distribution. So that's that question. Reproductive strategies, it's going to ask you what causes the population to increase or decrease in its growth rate. And it's going to generally refer to how many offspring they have, when the reproductive cycle is at, what are the chances of survival. So all of those things that we talked about that really play a role on how fast the population grows. I'm going to tweak one of them and say, oh, they reach their reproductive age earlier than they normally would. That's going to speed it up. That's going to increase it, because if you have faster reproductive cycles, you reach sexual maturity earlier, you're going to have a faster population growth rate. And so make sure you know some of those reproductive strategies. Most of them are pretty intuitive. If you increase the number of offspring per reproductive cycle, you're going to have an increased population growth rate. So this isn't too difficult of a question. Density-dependent factors and density-independent is almost identical to the natural selection question you had back in Lecture 16. The only difference is we're now talking about how it relates to the ecosystem and how these factors can keep the population density down in a number of ways. If it's a biological factor, such as predation and competition, those are density-dependent factors. If it's a non-biological environmental condition like weather and temperature, those are what we call density-independent factors. And so I'm going to use very much the similar question that I used when I was talking about natural selection, because it's pretty much the same thing. Carrying capacity, just know what's involved in that. Again, it's food, space, water, and energy. Okay, energy being sunlight, in particular with the producers in an ecosystem. And so those are the things that are the carrying capacity, the limited resources that prevent the species from going beyond a certain growth rate in any ecosystem. Population characteristics, make sure you know the difference between an opportunistic population and an equilibrium. Primarily, they're opposites of each other. Equilibrium populations have slow growth, opportunistic have fast growth. Equilibrium populations have larger organisms. Opportunistic populations tend to have smaller organisms. So they really are opposites of each other. That's why there's not too many questions I can do about this one. And then extinction, make sure you know the three factors that are the primary determinants of extinction. Again, that is their habitat size, their genetic diversity, and the number left in their species. Those are the three main factors that determine whether they're put on the endangered species list and they are prone to extinction. For these remaining 6, they each have their own question. Community interactions is primarily going to describe some type of interaction, whether it's competition or whether it's predation or commensalism, and you need to tell me which one I'm talking about. So those are pretty straightforward. Make sure you know what a keystone species is and what it isn't, right? This is a species that exerts a disproportionate influence on the diversity of the community. It's not the largest, it's not the most abundant, doesn't eat the most, it's not the apex predator. They can be, but that's not what defines them as the keystone species. They basically, when you lose them, they will cause a domino effect that loses a much of the diversity of the species in that area, which is why they're called a keystone species. And they're not always obvious, which is why it's difficult to know what effects you're going to have if you lose one of these species. Make sure you know the difference between primary and secondary succession. Primary is from scratch. Secondary occurs after something has caused the ecosystem to be lower in its diversity. A forest fire, plowing. Now, make sure you understand that a forest fire or plowing or a disruption of that is not secondary succession, right? Secondary succession is when the ecosystem is coming back from a loss of diversity because of some natural disaster, because of some predation or deforestation or something of that sort. So make sure you understand that secondary succession is not the event where you lose diversity. It is the development of the ecosystem after the loss of some of that diversity. Primary succession, it's easy. It starts from scratch, takes a long time. That's the difference. Ecological pyramid, make sure you know the 3 roles that species play. Make sure you know that pyramid in terms of what's in each of the trophic levels. At the bottom, you have the first trophic level, which is the producers. Then the second, third, and fourth trophic levels are the primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers in that order. And then, of course, you have the decomposers, which are off to the side of the ecological pyramid. I'm going to describe one of those areas, one of those groups, and you need to tell me which part of the ecosystem they belong to. So generally the answers will be producer, decomposer, primary consumer, secondary consumer, or tertiary consumer. Chemical cycles, you got the 3 chemical cycles, the phosphorus cycle, the nitrogen cycle, and the carbon cycle. So make sure you know primarily whether they are a gas state, a sedimentary state, or both, right? Phosphorus is just sedimentary, carbon is a gas state, and nitrogen is both. Also make sure you know the different bacteria that are used in the nitrogen cycle, because those show up on a possible quiz question. The nitrifying bacteria are the ones that bring nitrogen into the soil. The denitrifying bacteria are the ones that remove excess nitrates from the soil and put it into the atmosphere. And then for biomagnification and bioaccumulation, these are basically just definition questions, so make sure you know the difference between those two as we've described them.